When we think about the relationship between capitalism and the environment, it's all too easy to see them as separate spheres bouncing into one another. Capitalism devouring nature, like when a forest is raised for development, or nature threatening capitalist progress, like when a natural disaster wipes out that development.
But the relationship between nature and capitalism is much more complicated. Capitalism requires food, energy, and raw materials to create profit, and capitalists routinely reshape nature to suit their needs, while investing as little as possible to maximize that profit. At the same time, nature shapes capitalism too, often prompting crises that fundamentally change how capitalism operates.
As our guest today explained, the human relations of power and difference, production and reproduction, not only produce nature, they are products of nature. They explore these interrelationships through what they call the history of 7 cheap things.
You are listening to Who Makes Sense, a History of Capitalism podcast. I'm Betsy Beasley.
And I'm David Stein.
Who Makes Sense is a monthly podcast devoted to bringing you engaging stories that explain how capitalism has changed over time.
We interview historians and social and cultural critics about capitalism's past, highlighting the political and the economic changes that have created the present.
Today, we are joined by Raj Patel and Jason Moore. Let's start with you, Raj.
I am a research professor at the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin.
And I'm Jason Moore. I teach in the Department of Sociology at Binghamton University, and I am an environmental historian.
So we are the authors of A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, a guide to capitalism, nature, and the future of the planet.
In A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, Raj Patel and I tell the story of how our modern world became one of cheapness in an interesting kind of way, a liberating kind of way, but also a violent kind of way. That we are taught that the modern world and capitalism and markets are about efficiency. They are about delivering the highest quality of life at the cheapest and lowest price. And we turn that inside out, and we show how cheapness is not about efficiency. Cheapness is about violence. It is ingrained and inscribed in our relations of racism and sexism and class inequality and the long history of colonialism.
Maybe the way to flesh out what the book's about is to look at these 7 cheap things, and they are nature, work, care, food, energy, money, and lives. And the argument that we make in the book is that these 7 things are central to the emergence and the perpetuation of modern capitalism. But we're also making the argument that because they are in various ways coming to an end, that this perpetual sort of hunt for cheapness that capitalism is premised upon also means that capitalism itself is coming to an end. That we are moving to a period of a profound state shift in the way that our planet behaves, and the economic system that and we're using economic in shiver quotes here, but the social and natural and sort of relationships between humans and the rest of the web of life that have emerged and that we term capitalism, that has to change as the planet itself changes.
That's exactly right. This is a book that asks us to rethink some of the most powerful and influential ideas that have made the world we inhabit. They are words like capitalism, we just heard Raj speak about. They are words like nature and society. It's almost unthinkable to narrate a history of the modern world in which you don't assume that there is a realm of nature, of fields and forests and critters and diseases over in one domain of existence, and then all the social relations of colonialism and racism and economic development and all of that in another realm. And we open up and invite the reader to reflect on how the history of the modern world is, in fact, much messier. And in fact, these ideas of nature with an uppercase N and society with an uppercase S, these have been implicated in a long history of colonialism and capitalism, going back to Columbus, going back to the English in Ireland, going back to a potent cocktail of racism, of money, of power, and of the accumulation of wealth.
What drove you all to write this book?
We've been plagiarizing each other for a while, and that's the sort of comic explanation for how it is that we came across each other's work. Is that I've been doing stuff on the long green revolution. Jason, of course, had been working prior to that as part of a much deeper project on world ecology, and we found ourselves using each other's ideas, and then our eyes met across a conference room here at the University of Texas when Jason was invited down to a World History Conference, and we got to drinking, as academics do, and we realized that there was a need both to I mean, Jason's ideas are so important, as you can read in Capitalism and the Web of Life, but they also needed a bigger audience, and we needed, I think, both of us to work out some ideas around finance, around race, and around gender. That had laid that were present but latent in many of the ideas that we've been reading on world ecology and capitalism, and so this was an opportunity for us to explore some of these ideas more deeply and with an intellectual companionship that I think that we both enjoyed tremendously.
That's right. What Raj has laid out is perfect, and there's also a long history for us both in tackling questions of food and agriculture as central to human history. And as anyone who has ever farmed or even gardened knows, the division between culture and nature is completely fictive. Indeed, we have a term agriculture that brings these two moments together of the web of life and of humans with all sorts of species, with plants and critters and all the rest. So I think that anyone who takes seriously the idea of food and agriculture understands that at every point we are dealing not just with issues of metabolism, of human and extra-human natures in a metabolism, but we are also dealing with questions of work, of power, of markets and money. So anyone who deals with these questions understands that the social world of food and agriculture is in fact mediated and penetrated at every turn by all manner of natures in the web of life, by climate and weather, by diseases, by invasive species, by soil conditions. And so what we try to do in talking about this rather unusual formulation that we call world ecology with, as academics like to do, we put in a hyphen there because we're talking about how human beings create organizations that are ecologies unto themselves. And by organizations, they might be a family or a community, but they might also be a civilization like capitalism. And world ecology says that every moment of these human organizations is wrapped up with the web of life in immediate and intimate ways, that it is impossible to think through questions of race and gender and other forms of inequality, as well as forms of the accumulation of wealth in the modern world, which have been prodigious and increasingly unequal, as we've learned from the recent Oxfam report. 42 people in the world have more wealth than the bottom half of the population, of the world's population. We're saying that these questions of power and economy are at every step related to an unruly and powerful set of natures culminating, of course, in the biosphere itself and the relations of this planet to the solar system and all the rest. And if you think that that doesn't matter to human history, you can look at what climate historians have been saying, that it matters what the orbit of the planet around the sun is. So what we're trying to do is to really bring the question of nature into the heart of questions of power and inequality in the history of the modern world, but also of justice and forging what we call a reparation ecology moving forward in an era of climate change.
In the book, you argue that we should use the term capitalocene instead of Anthropocene, which is common in environmental studies circles. Could you tell us about these terms and why you choose to use capitalocene?
One of the most influential environmentalist concepts of the 21st century is this strange word called Anthropocene. And if it sounds like geological speak, it is. It means literally age of man. And the geologists introduced a concept called the Anthropocene to help us come to terms with the specific contributions of, let's just call it modern society, to the geological record. And lately, they've come up with 3 candidates for what intelligent beings millions of years from now might find in the geological record from the history of the modern world. They are plastics, chicken bones, and nuclear residues from atomic testing after World War II. So that's one layer of what Anthropocene, age of man, means. It is a discussion over the geological record, and I've called this the geological Anthropocene. Now, that might sound a bit too detailed, but here's the punchline. The geological Anthropocene has given way to a much more popular notion of the Anthropocene, the age of man. And this is what I call the popular Anthropocene. And it says that the history of the modern world is a history of the past 200 years. It is a history of the antagonism of human beings on one side and nature on the other side, such that, in the words of Anthropocene advocates, humans are now overwhelming the great forces of nature. Now, we say several things about this. The alternative to the popular Anthropocene is what we call the capitalocene. Now, right away, people will say, well, you can't just say that the capitalists are all to blame and it's more complicated than that, and we need to think more deeply about that, and that the problems of climate change aren't just about an economic system. To which we would say, yes, absolutely, 100%, except with, let's make some qualifications. The capitalocene means the age of capital, and it says that the problems of mass extinction, runaway climate change, the acidification of the oceans, and the other movements of transgression of key planetary systems and their thresholds, to use the language of Earth system scientists, is the outcome of 5 centuries of how capital, power, and nature have been woven together and assembled so as to benefit the 1% or the 0.1%, or who knows how we calculate the 42 people who own more wealth than the bottom 500 million. That it is a problem of a system of relations. That is, relations of power, like colonialism, racism, sexism. It is a question of the relations of how work is organized, not just wage workers, but the unpaid work, especially the care work of overwhelmingly women and peoples of color, historically and in the present. And finally, that to talk about the origins of today's crisis means that we have to stop seeing that the history of ecological crisis is one either of overpopulation that begins, presumably, in England in the 18th century, or is a history of big machines and big resources like coal and steam engines, again, presumably in England in the 18th century. This did not begin in England. It began with Columbus, with this unsavory marriage of power and money and the conquest of nature as this fundamental good that would carry forth civilization across the world. And that is a process that begins as we tell every chapter in this book. We tell a story of the modern world that begins with Columbus around cheap money and cheap energy and cheap work and cheap care. And we show how the relations that gave rise to the Industrial Revolution were in fact forged much earlier in the era of Columbus and colonialism and the birth of capitalism as a world ecology.
And to round that out, I mean, I think that there's a great advantage in shifting away the talk of the systems changes and state shifts that we're about to experience on Earth, away from this talk of the Anthropocene, precisely because if we recognize that it's not just humans being humans, there's some sort of innate and inevitable product of human behavior that the Earth should have these radioisotopes, or that the plastic should, at some point in the future, weigh more than the fish in the sea, or that we have these, that we have trillions of chicken bones, that the processes that result in the domestic chicken being the world's most popular bird are not something that's innate to human beings, but that is in fact the outcome of processes that begin with Columbus. Then all of a sudden we start to be able to name an enemy. We start to be able to organize for political change, because if the problem is not in our inner natures, that it's not inevitable that humans should do this to the planet, but that in fact there are, as Jason was saying, the 0.001% or whoever it is who are profiting from this, and that we are in various ways incited to participate in capitalism, then we get to dream about what comes after capitalism with a much more lucidity than if we believe that the Anthropocene is just, well, it's humans being humans. Of course, we are doomed to perish under capitalism because that's what humans do. So there's an important politics that accompanies the shift in naming from moving from Anthropocene to Capitalocene. And it's a shift that we are hopeful about. So even though we're talking about these profound state shifts on Earth that are undoubtedly going to involve a great deal of suffering, by moving from thinking of the Anthropocene to the Capitalocene, we also equip ourselves with the psychological and political tools to be able to imagine what it might be like to survive and thrive under a system that isn't capitalism.
Something that a lot of people with an environmental bent seem to discuss, even just offhand, is the idea that we have too many people, that our expanding population is one of the biggest environmental challenges facing us in the future. What do you say to that line of argument?
So the idea that population will outstrip the capacity of the planet or particular parts of the planet to produce food, clothing, and other necessaries is one with a long history that precedes that of Malthus, who was an Englishman of the ruling class in England in the 18th century. He publishes his famous first essay in 1798. That's important. It's important for several reasons. One is that in 1798, Malthus, as a man of the English ruling class, had seen worldwide anti-colonial revolt. Indeed, in 1798, the great fear of the English ruling classes, a revolt by the Irish, occurred. But it was also the era of revolts, not just in what became the United States and in France, but also in places like Pugachev, a peasant revolt against cash crop and market-oriented production, a revolt in Peru against Spanish colonial rule in the 1780s. It was also a response to the crisis of English agriculture, of what's called the First Agricultural Revolution. So it was a crisis in which the productivity of English agriculture had collapsed. Per capita food consumption in England had fallen over the previous 50 years. And yet at the same time, because peasants had been pushed off the land, there were fundamentally new patterns of family formation that allowed for population increase. So Malthus wasn't stupid. He just mistook a temporary moment in history for an eternal condition, that is, the exhaustion of one agricultural revolution. And he didn't foresee new agricultural revolutions resolving the problem. So as Raj has talked about, there is a long green revolution. And in my book, I plagiarized his term and said there's an even longer green revolution that comes to the rescue of English agriculture and the problem of population. Now, those are two key moments of it. There's another moment of it, which is that this is the era in world history where we get the word strike. In 1768, sailors in London, the capitalist world's largest port, shut down the port by striking their sails. Now, what is the context of this? Well, Thomas Malthus was in many ways the world's first professional economist, and he was employed at the East India Company's college. He was chair of political economy there from 1805. That's important because it brings together one of the fathers, and I do mean fathers, of modern economics, with one of the key colonial operations of its times. And so we need to understand that modern economics and neoclassical economics is fundamentally shaped by not just a fear of overpopulation, but the use of overpopulation as a way of disciplining colonial populations, especially those in revolt, and I would say civil rights movements subsequently, but also worker unrest. So we have a lot of different dimensions of this coming together. Now, famously in 1968, Paul Ehrlich published, with the endorsement of the Sierra Club, The Population Bomb. And if you read the first 2 or 3 pages of that, you can see this racial anxiety dripping off the pages as he describes a trip to New Delhi in India. Now, at the time, New Delhi, in about 1965, New Delhi had about 2 million people. Paris had about 8 million. So it was clear that from the beginning of modern environmentalism in 1968, racism and the practices of colonial domination were squarely at the center of this so-called overpopulation problem. And that has carried through to the present, that the concerns about overpopulation have always been shot through with racism and sexism. We can just recall that in 1973, 14 states had legislation before the state legislatures to mandate sterilization for women on welfare. That's just a tiny tidbit that we can take away from this. But too many people always means too many people of color. And that has to be located squarely at how we critique those who raise the specter of overpopulation. Now, does it mean we don't need to pay attention to population? Of course we need to pay attention to population. But neo-Malthusianism is about finding an eternal condition ingrained in what Paul Ehrlich called billions of years of evolution. It is about locating the problems of a very specific moment here in 2018 within billions of years of evolution and the drive to procreate. That's not only bad history, it is straight out racist, anti-immigrant, colonialist, sexist, go on down the list.
One way of thinking about that, the consequences of Malthus, is, in fact, to recognize that in many ways he's alive and well, even in the 21st century. The idea that a ruling class is always scared of what the working class will do when it gets hungry, as Jason was saying, it predates capitalism, but the way that Malthus presents the logic, I think, is very modern. The idea that essentially that there are these scientific immutable rules of human procreation and want are both the basis of modern economics, but also in some ways the sort of underlying philosophy behind a lot of modern politics. So if one looks at, for example, the Green Revolution, the sort of series of policies that were put together by the U.S. government after the Mexican nationalization of oil resources in the 1930s. The Green Revolution emerges as a way of using science to undercut worker uprising. in Mexico. So the idea of the Green Revolution, in fact, the name Green Revolution, it's named the Green Revolution because it is not the Red Revolution of the Soviets nor the White Revolution of the Shah of Iran. It is the Green Revolution, and this term coined by a man called William Goud, who was the administrator for the United States Agency for International Development, makes very clear that one of the ways that governments are going to manage the population bomb and understand the population bomb is not just that there are fecund people in the global south, but that they are fecund people who might become communist if their hunger overtakes their reason. And so the technologies of food production and of fertilizer distribution, of irrigation, of food marketing boards, of rural infrastructure, of land reform, all of these are technologies to quash communism and to quash worker power. And that you can even see you can see it in the Green Revolution. You can see it in the Arab Spring. One of the last things that the Tunisian leader Ben Ali did before he was deposed was to drop the price of bread by 30%, in the belief that if only the masses at his door were able to have bread, they would quiet down and stop demanding political change. So again, the element of population is stitched up with ideas of food and of power and of politics. And if we are to understand how these things stitch together and understand how Malthus lives, then we don't have to look very far. We can find it in precisely, as Jason was saying, the racist discourse of modern environmentalism, and we can also find it in the foreign policy of the United States and increasingly of China as well.
And also in these movements of defense of the right to food and for centuries before that, not only the defense of the right to food, but the defense of the right to land, defense of the commons against those who would enclose and marketize land and food. At the forefront of those struggles were women, overwhelmingly. And as we point out in the book, the drawing on Silvia Federici, the defense of common lands in Europe and witch hunts went together. So this question of access to land and class and inequality and nature in the modern world is, as we showed, gendered at every turn. And what modern economics in particular tries to do, but also much too much of modern environmentalism has done, is to erase the question of gender as fundamental to these questions.
There are parts of the left that tend to see the environmental movement as in conflict with, or as a distraction from, fights for social justice. But you see these movements as inherently intersectional.
One of the fundamental divides in progressive politics over the past 50 years has been something that can roughly be called jobs versus environment. There have been environmental movements, of course, but also labor movements, and they have often failed to capture the fundamental contributions of each other. So this is brought to center stage in our book because work is the way, or one of the key ways, that the modern world has forged its distinctive and destructive ecologies of power, capital, and nature. And the error of traditional labor and socialist movements has been to hold to a sacred object called the worker, the wage worker, the industrial worker, who of course is overwhelmingly white and male up until the 1970s. So this has, of course, changed fundamentally since then. But the question of work has to be at the center of how we think of biospheric crisis. And biospheric crisis has to be at the center of how we understand not just wage work, but of how capitalism mobilizes both human work, but also extra-human work, like the work of animals or the work of rivers, in a dynamic way that is, of course, also destructive. So when we ask who is the worker, we have to say, yes, industrial workers, office workers, wage work, but we also have to say the informal workers across the world, but especially in the megacities of the global south. We have to also say workers in agriculture. We have to also say all of the care work, and paid and, more importantly, unpaid. Capitalism shuts down tomorrow if it has to pay for all of the care work that goes into reproducing life and community and society and work. So for me, this is an extraordinary opportunity for us to have a serious conversation around how to put questions of work at the center of nature and how to put questions of nature at the center of our labor politics. And if we can do that, we can begin to look for new opportunities politically to coalesce movements around so-called economic justice and those around so-called environmental justice, and to see that these are simply two moments of a dynamic whole in which, if we want to confront and overturn the violence and dynamism of capitalism, then we have to have a fundamental strategy for building alliances around work and against how capitalism organizes work in all of its forms, paid and unpaid, human and extra-human. And that's important because if left politics, if progressive politics treats nature as capitalism has, as a productive asset, then that is going to involve prodigious violence and inequality amongst humans. And we see this clearly in the recent experience of places like Bolivia, where nature has become a productive asset, and that has embroiled the Morales administration in conflicts with indigenous peoples. We are going to see this again and again and again. The emancipation of the web of life is not an add-on to the emancipation of humans.
And we've seen this in the labor movement in the past. I mean, those who've seen this very famous picture of the South African Communist Party in the 1930s will recall a sign that says, "White workers of the world unite." And the fact that was thinkable at the time and that now it's laughable is, I think, a healthy reflection of the kinds of debates that are possible within the labor movement to expand the idea of what the proletariat is. And these debates are happening in other locations. And certainly when you're seeing alliances between indigenous people and labor movements, as Jason has written about very powerfully, in the understanding of Standing Rock, for example. You see one aspect of the expansion of the idea of the proletariat, but outside the English-speaking world, there's plenty of very, very powerful organizing and intellectual debate happening that reflects on the ground realities about how it is that people are rethinking and reapproaching and organizing differently around the web of life. If you look to the work of the international peasant movement, La Via Campesina, there's some fantastic work happening around feminismo campesino popular, so popular peasant feminism that rejects a certain kind of northern feminism that instrumentalizes nature and that discounts rural life, and in which instead you have some very vibrant and very forceful arguments about patriarchy and about the domination of nature being of a piece, which is essentially a central part of the argument that we make in A History of the World in Seven Cheap Things.
And I think world ecology is very much informed and inspired and continues to be so by movements precisely like food sovereignty. The claims that democracy and gender equality and the right to land are embedded in the right to food is an extraordinary concept and is a fundamentally anti-modernist concept, because it says that the right to nutrition is inseparable from the imperative of the right to land or gender equality. And if we pause to think about it just for a moment, we can consider just how revolutionary that really is.
We often think of nature as something separate from social relations, something that exists outside humans and that humans interact with. In this formulation, capitalism is a system that inherently destroys the purity of nature. But you see this relationship as much more complicated.
Well, of course, there is profound destruction and profound violence, but to fully grasp that, we have to understand how capitalism works. Yes, capitalism has been more adept than any other civilization at killing human beings, killing all sorts of life on this planet. We know this. We're in the midst of a sixth mass extinction. Now, I think that's a euphemism. It is a mass extermination. And so part of how we understand capitalism has to put the drive to extermination at its core. My friend Justin McBrien says it's not just a capitalocene, it's a necrocene. So we have to understand that, but we also have to understand how is it that capitalism as a perverse kind of economic system, how does it work? And if you boil it down to its simplest expression, it works because capitalism has created and accumulated an ever increasing amount of wealth in the form of this weird beast called capital by going to frontiers and creating frontiers of cheap natures. Now, that means something very specific in our book, because when we say cheap nature, all of a sudden we think about cheap oil, cheap food, cheap elements of reality that are outside of human relations. But in fact, one of the fundamental points of the book is that the effect of nature, of cheap nature as a strategy, has been historically to move the majority of human beings from membership in society, from membership in civilization, into the realm of nature so that they could be put to work as cheaply as possible. So as we tell in the book around the history of Spanish colonialism, the indigenous peoples were regarded as imperfect matter, and their only path to salvation was to work cheaply, of course, and that meant to be worked to death. So here we have a potent example of how indigenous peoples were not part of Christendom. They were not part of civilization. They were part of nature. And that is a history that has been repeated again and again and again in the early modern centuries around African slavery, but also virtually all women were expelled from society. They were part of nature, the better that their work could be delivered cheaply.
You argue that the chicken nugget really illustrates well the dynamics that you're talking about, and it shows the relationship among all 7 cheap things. Tell us about that.
If you want an example of why we should call it the Capitalocene rather than the Anthropocene, let's look at chicken. The chicken nugget is, we argue, one of the iconic presentations of capitalism because it embodies the 7 cheap things rather well. First of all, it is cheap nature. You know, the idea that humans would domesticate, and that's a word that has a particular valence in our book, but domesticate this wildfowl from the jungles of Asia and feel free to mess with its genetics so that the modern broiler has breasts so big that the animal itself can't walk. And then, and to feel that is something that is entirely within humans' capacity to do to other things within the web of life. That's an example of cheap nature. And of course, these chickens don't turn themselves into nuggets by themselves. They require work. But workers in the chicken industry are far more likely to be exposed to injury and to be exploited. And so, again, this is an example of cheap work. When their bodies are broken on the production line, workers are then discarded, and it is to the communities from whence they came that often have to they're returned, and that those communities are responsible for their care. In not paying for that care, capitalism demonstrates again that the importance of cheap care. Once these nuggets are ready to be ferried around, they require cheap energy. And that the energy that's required again is brought about through fossil fuels, and we make the argument in the book that the per barrel cost of extraction of fossil fuels is rising, and obviously fossil fuels are responsible for propelling forward the sixth extinction. Of course, the workers themselves need cheap food, as do the chickens, and the chicken industry benefits from in the United States a subsidy of $1.25 billion a year for chicken feed, and again these nuggets are part of an economy in which they form part of the cheap food that workers need in order to have wages suppressed. For the chicken to be sold, there need to be loans, cheap money. The low interest rate loans are, again, part of the argument, a part of the process for propelling capitalism forward. And in the United States, every KFC is considered a small business and therefore eligible for loans from the Small Business Administration. But when interest rates are historically as low as they are, there's not really much further one can go for reducing interest rates. So again, that's a reason why the era of cheap money may be on its way out. And finally, this is premised on the idea of cheap lives, of being able to govern and denominate certain kinds of people whose lives are worth less than others. And so if you look on the chicken production line, it is women and people of color who are disproportionately represented. And together, the chicken industry both embodies the seven cheap things, but it is, again, a sign that, that we should call it the capitalocene, because the fact that there are 12 billion chickens alive now, but not for long. Humans go through 50 billion chickens a year. And so when we do have an alien civilization coming to uncover what passes for human civilization now, what they will find is trillions and trillions of chicken bones that are laid there not because of anthropos, not because of human tendencies, but rather because of the complex processes that constitute modern capitalism.
What paths forward are possible for people to challenge the politics of these seven cheap things and the hold they have on our lives?
There are movements already that are taking very seriously the limitations of approaching the problems of capitalism purely by a traditional understanding of building worker power within a factory, partly because of deindustrialization, partly because while there's a tremendous number of strikes happening in the world's industrial heartland in China, the kinds of political organizing that are required that our book presents as an ongoing challenge are the kinds that go far beyond what it is that one can achieve by downing tools in a factory. But what we find tremendously important, and the debate that we wanted to contribute to, is the fact that there are so many movements globally that are thinking about labor power, but also thinking about reproductive labor and thinking about the boundary between humans and nature as artificially constructed through colonialism, and understanding race and racism and the origins of scientific racism in colonialism and capitalism. And so when you look at the movement for Black Lives and their demands for reparations and local sovereignty, when you look at La Via Campesina and the demands for food sovereignty that are also demands for an end to domestic violence, what you're finding, and when you look at, for example, at indigenous movements and indigenous rights, again, to sovereignty and to the status of personhood for nature, what you're seeing is a very profound inversion of some of the sort of forces of cheapness that we detail in the book. And what we see as tremendously important is precisely the binding together of labor and ecological and First Nation and gender rights and food sovereignty movements in ways that can help forge a common politics.
I think that's absolutely right. And let me add another wrinkle to everything Raj just said. It is often remarked that it is easier for most people to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I think this is true for many radicals. and many who would regard themselves as on the left. I think that there is a fear of the end of capitalism for people on the left as well as other people, that it will spell disaster for everyone. So I would begin with a couple of remarks in terms of imagining the politics that are possible. One is that we must cease to be afraid of the breakdown of the system. And that is grounded in a very sound historical experience. If we look at the breakdown of civilizations previously, and we tell the story of the end of feudal Europe, we can see some important things. For one, the collapse of feudal power in the 14th century was, first of all, in an era of climate change, in an era of food and agroecological crisis. But feudalism's 1% was not brought down by climate. It was brought down by workers and peasants organizing on an expanded scale to say, hell no, we're not going back to the worst, the most coercive elements of feudalism, of the classic picture of serf labor that you get in your high school textbooks. Indeed, this is part of what we're seeing in capitalism today, a return to some of the most savage forms of capital accumulation, of violent accumulation by dispossession across the world. The other lesson is that when the power of the 1% is decisively compromised, everyone lives better. And this is not an exceptional thing when we talk about what happened in Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. This is also what happened with the collapse of Roman power after its long era of favorable climate ended around the year 300. 75, 76 years later, the Goths crossed the Danube, and by 476, Roman power, or by 452, or whatever your favorite date is for the end of Roman power in the West, Roman power collapses. And that ushers in centuries of prosperous living for peasantries across Western Europe. So the lesson is that the collapse, the breakdown of the system means above all the breakdown of the relations of power that sustain the 1%, the ruling classes in any given era, and that the power of that 1% in eras of runaway climate change and rebellion, the power of that 1% is not so resilient. And we ought to remember that.
In the book, you also bring up reparations, specifically something that you term reparation ecology.
It's a very difficult conversation, I've noticed, to have on the white left, to think and to engage in talk about reparations. And I think that part of what it is that we're doing at the end of the book by thinking of encouraging the idea of reparation ecology is to really encourage the discipline of thinking historically about where and when we find ourselves. By urging the idea of reparation ecology, what we're doing is reminding readers and activists and radicals that capitalism wasn't and it won't be again. What we're doing is suggesting that in the meantime, there are ways of taking relationships to our unearned power and privilege that we need to own, particularly in a moment of Me Too and Time's Up. It's important, for example, for men to recognize how we have been conscripted into patriarchy, that we benefit from it whether we like it or not, and we must do our best to smash it. How do we do that? Well, we're through allyship. These ideas are ones that are important, and certainly the idea of reparations for patriarchy are ones that we definitely need to engage in, we need to talk about and enact. Other parts of the world are taking those ideas much more seriously, and I think that if we're ready to have the conversation about, all right, how do we end patriarchy, we should also be simultaneously ready to have the conversation about, well, how do we take relationship to white supremacy? How do we understand the idea that the land is stolen? How do we understand that the way we live is premised on relations to the web of life that have prejudiced other parts of the world's possibility of being able to live the way that we do? And that's the idea of reparation ecology, that it is a discipline of understanding historically where we find ourselves, understanding precisely that in moving away from capitalism, we will, as Jason so eloquently pointed out, be moving away from a world of the power of the 1% and distributing power much more equitably, much more democratically, but understanding that in order to get there, we do need to take relationships to the power that has put us, the relationships of power and the historical relationships that put us in the moment that we have, that we find ourselves in right now. So that's the idea behind reparation ecology, that it is a discipline that both binds together different social movements, but also encourages us to think historically and ecologically about the past and also about the future.
And it speaks so powerfully to the amnesia that modern society imposes on us. But I would say not just on all of us, even in some ways, especially on the left, that there is a profound sense of forgetting that we in the United States are living on stolen land, on blood-soaked land, on land that has been turned into private property through genocide in every sense of that word. So to speak of reparation ecology is not to say simply, oh, let's write a check. That's not what it's about, although monetary remuneration does matter. It is about remembering, and it's not just the amnesia that reparation ecology and world ecology speak to. It is also the anesthesia that is given to us by a certain kind of left academic approach, which is that capitalism is an economic system, that we need to understand it as separate from the web of life, and that in practice we are not going to understand the accumulation of wealth in the form of capital, which exists only to make more capital. We are going to pretend that that is not soaked through and through in the violence of racialized and gendered and colonial domination from the beginning. It is not just an old socialist fairy tale of capitalists exploiting workers. Yes, that happens, but that is not the whole story and not even most of the story. So if we think about something like the Industrial Revolution, we are taught to forget, even by Marxists, that the really decisive transformations of the world that enabled the Industrial Revolution was not digging up coal in Newcastle. It was exterminating Native Americans, and it was bringing Africans to the United States and setting them to work on cotton plantations. So, and that was violent in many, many ways, enduring ways that continue to shape our world today. So we have to allow ourselves to be uncomfortable with the kinds of calls for relationships and connections that reparation ecology is really there to remind us of, that we need to make new connections that say gendered and racial domination are not separate from the questions of sustainability, are not separate from the questions of the working class and the transformation of capitalism into something more just and equitable.
If you liked our show, make sure to check us out at whomakesensepodcast.com. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/whomakesense, and follow us on Twitter at whomakesense. And let us know if there are topics that you want to know more about.
You can also learn more about Raj and Jason's work at our website, whomakesensepodcast.com.
Who Makes Sense is now partnered with Verso Books, the largest independent radical publishing house in the English-speaking world. You can download our episodes a few days early via the Verso blog. Check it out at versobooks.com/blogs.
We would also love it if you could rate and review us on iTunes. That helps us find more listeners who can enjoy the show.
Join us next month for more Histories of Capitalism.